So whenever the Game Boy is brought up, you might hear about the Game Gear, which was their biggest competitor, but there was another handheld console that tried to compete in that market, the Atari Lynx. However, this console tends to be forgotten. It shares a lot of similarities with the Game Gear, like the backlit screen, the colorful graphics, and even the form factor looks kind of similar. But how does this console differ from the competition, and why did it fail? Well, let's take a look. What's going on? It's Pojer coming at you with another video. So we're going to be talking about the Atari Lynx today. I'd love to be talking about the Atari 2600 Plus, and I do have it in the mail, but it has not arrived yet, sadly. I also wanted to make an announcement. I did do a stream with Retro Bliss yesterday, as of this recording, so about a week ago now. We did a live stream of the Atari acquisitions, and I had a blast being a guest on his channel, and I most likely will be showing up in future videos of his.
I'm supposed to get my 2600 on Friday. So are you getting one anytime soon?
I checked the FedEx page. Supposedly it's coming in tomorrow by the end of the day. Okay. So I'm hoping for the best. I don't know if I'll have a lot of time. Oh, look at you showing off.
Hold on a second. He's out of here. Okay.
He's grounded.
Do me a favor, drop him a subscription. He makes great content. I'm a big fan of his channel. Also, before we continue, check to see really quick if you're subscribed to the channel. If you're not, hit that subscribe button right there. It's only a small thing, but it helps our channel grow. Alright, I've held you up long enough. Let's talk about the Atari Lynx.
Stacked with more games for total satisfaction. It'll blow you away. Lynx, more fun and games from Atari.
The Atari 2600 was a big success in the late 70s and early 80s, but Atari had trouble finding the same footing after that. To compete with the Intellivision, Atari released the 5200. On paper, this console was way better than its predecessor in terms of hardware, but it had a very poor lineup of games, the controller was notably bad, and it was not backwards compatible with 2600 games. The console did not sell well, and it was discontinued in less than 2 years. On top of that, while the 2600 was successful in its early years, Atari's diminishing reputation, lack of quality control, and increased amount of bad games led to people losing trust in the gaming industry. No one was interested in buying video game consoles or cartridges anymore, and a lot of people blamed Atari for this. This would cause the upcoming Atari 7800 to be delayed. When the console finally did come out, it did fix a lot of the problems that the 5200 had. The controller was more reliable, and the console was backwards compatible with the 2600. However, the NES was already out, and that console won over consumers. To be fair, there were some hardware advantages with the 7800 over the NES, and we can see that with a few homebrew titles. But the console's original lineup of games was pretty weak, and none of them fully utilized the hardware's potential. The 7800 was a decent console, but it didn't have the best lineup of games, and the NES had more support from third-party companies as well as consumers. It didn't help that Atari's reputation was really bad at this point. Despite the lack of success, Atari wasn't going to throw in the towel yet, and they would be given a nice opportunity. In 1986, the company Epyx, who was known for their titles Winter Games and Summer Games, began development on a handheld console called the Handy Game. This was ahead of its time because the Game Boy didn't even start development yet. Epyx showed a prototype of the Handy Game at the 1989 Winter Consumer Electronics Show. However, the company began having financial issues and they needed to find another game company to help fund this console. They initially asked Sega and Nintendo if they wanted to be partners, but both of them declined. Funny enough, both companies would eventually make their own portable consoles anyway. However, Atari welcomed Epyx with open arms, and they would become business partners for this new console. Atari would handle the production and the marketing of the console, while Epyx would handle the software development. However, this agreement would not last for long, as Epyx's financial issues would catch up to them and they would file for bankruptcy. So Atari would end up taking on this entire task by themselves. Epyx gave them a head start, but they would be on their own from now on. Atari would showcase their console called the Portable Color Entertainment System at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show. The name would be later changed to the Atari Lynx, and the console would launch on September 1st for $180. The Lynx saw some initial success. They shipped out 50,000 units to stores, and they managed to sell 90% of them. It's worth mentioning that the Game Boy was released 1 month prior to the Lynx in the US and 5 months prior in Japan. On paper, the Atari Lynx had way more powerful hardware than the Game Boy. There's a few obvious advantages, like the Lynx's very large color palette compared to the Game Boy's, which wasn't in color at all. It could only support 4 shades of gray. The Lynx had a color palette of 4,096 colors, or 16 colors per scan line. The Lynx also had 64 kilobytes of RAM, while the Game Boy only had 8 kilobytes of general purpose RAM and 8 kilobytes of video RAM, although some games did contain external RAM. Another big advantage over the Game Boy, the Lynx had a backlit screen, which was a first of its kind. This is huge because you could maybe go on a road trip and still see the screen when it's dark outside. The console was also capable of sprite scaling, and we would see this in numerous games. So with that said, let's take a look at a few games. Let's start with Scrapyard Dog. I've talked about the 7800 version already, so let's take a look at this one. Your dog gets captured and you have to save them from Mr. Big. You might have to get out your pocket sand for this one. It's a basic platformer where you walk to the right and you can throw a projectile at the enemies. The game has some sprite scaling, which looks cool. This version is a lot more stiff than the 7800 one. In that version, it was very floaty, almost like a Mario game. I wish they had kept the floatiness in this one because Atari really needs a Mario-style platformer. The controls are not the best. The stiffness makes it hard to land your jumps, and you can't aim your projectile in any directions besides left and right. It's an okay game, but the 7800 version is better. Now let's try Toki. Your girlfriend gets captured and you're turned into an ape, so you must save her while in ape form. It's a basic platformer where you're able to spit at the enemies. You can collect weapons that greatly increase your firepower, but they're only temporary. The game actually reminds me of Contra because of the various weapons you can collect and the excellent controls. I really appreciate that you can shoot in multiple directions like up and diagonally. Toki is one of my favorite arcade games, and it's a shame that this title didn't get enough representation on home consoles, but I'm glad it made it to the Lynx because it's a great version. Let's try Warbirds. So here's an interesting fun fact. This game was originally included in the Switch version of Atari 50, but an early patch update would remove it, so if you buy this game and you don't let the update happen, you get one extra game. It's unclear why Atari removed this game. So anyway, it's a flight simulator. We can really see the sprite scaling and rotation on the screen, and it does look nice. But the game is slow, and it actually gets kind of boring. Honestly, it doesn't hold my attention for more than 30 seconds. I don't mind that they removed this from Atari 50. Another game that showed off the capabilities was Battlezone 2000. Not much to say about this game, but we see some nice 3D vector-style graphics, which is something that the Game Boy certainly couldn't do. The Lynx did get its share of platformers like Todd's Adventure and Slime World. The game scrolls in multiple directions, and your mission is to collect crystals while avoiding the slime. It's playable, but the controls are rough. When you shoot, your character, I guess his name is Todd, locks in place. You can aim diagonally, but it's weird that you can't move while shooting. But it's still a decent addition to the Lynx library. The console did get a few arcade ports including Pac-Land, Paperboy, Ms. Pac-Man, and others. Atari gave us a compilation that featured Missile Command and Asteroids. These are mainly remakes with updated graphics, but they did make some upgrades. In Missile Command, you can purchase upgrades that help you along the way. Nothing special, but it's an alright compilation. There's a few racing games like Road Blasters. This is kind of a combination of racing and shooting. It's one of the better looking games on the console. I mean, the frame rate is excellent here. I think it's cool that they played it safe and made a Rad Racer style game instead of trying to throw in 3D vector graphics like Battlezone 2000. I'm sure the frame rate would have tanked in that case. This is a decent title, and I'm glad it was brought over to the Lynx. Another really silly game to look at here is Fat Bobby. That boy ain't right, I guess. The premise is that some guy, I assume this might be Fat Bobby, steals all your band members and you gotta go and save them. I find it kind of weird that when you're standing still you have your guitar, but when you're moving or jumping it magically disappears. Like what, does he put it in his pocket or something? Your jumping is also very delayed in this game, so there's been times where I've fallen into the lava when I feel like that shouldn't have happened. I don't have too much to say about it, it's a decent game, but I only covered it because the name is really funny. So the console had superior hardware over the Game Boy, it had a large color palette, the sprite scaling in some of the games was nice, and it had a backlit screen. But despite the console being better on paper, it still couldn't compete with the competition. The Game Boy had a lot going for it. It was bundled with Tetris, which drew in a lot of consumers. The console also had a much better lineup of games, and the battery life was way better. Remember earlier when I said you could maybe go on a road trip? That's because the Lynx only had 4 to 5 hours of battery life versus the Game Boy's 30 hours. That's hardly enough to do anything. The Game Boy was also less expensive, only $90. Another problem was the Game Gear, which came out about 6 months after the Lynx. These two consoles were similar because they both had a backlit screen and they were in color. The Lynx actually had superior battery life than the Game Gear, but the console loses in nearly every other aspect. The Game Gear had a smaller form factor, the price was $30 less, and it had a better lineup of games, although not as good as the Game Boy. Another thing, look how small the screen is compared to the whole console. Would you want to play this? To be fair though, Atari did come out with the Lynx 2 later on, which was smaller, had a better battery life, and was cheaper. So what ended up happening to the Lynx? Well, Atari wanted to shift focus to the home console market where there was a lot of competition going on, so they would eventually drop the Lynx in favor of the Atari Jaguar, which came out in November 1993. The Lynx would be officially discontinued in 1995, although a few games were released afterwards, like that really silly Fat Bobby game. Despite the console not performing well against this competition, the console was ambitious. It was the first handheld console to have a backlit LCD screen, and the hardware was impressive. Some of the games looked really nice, but the battery life was horrible, it was more expensive than its competition, and it had a poor lineup of games. Not to mention that Atari gave up on it a little bit too early. Like with other consoles, its superior hardware wasn't enough to beat Nintendo. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.